Picture this. You're a Japanese pilot in 1943. You've spent years training in the art of aerial combat. You sit inside your Mitsubishi Zero, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a machine that once ruled the skies. The Zero was feared, respected, and talked about as untouchable. In the first months of the war, you and your fellow pilots cut through American planes like a hot knife through butter. The Wildcat, too slow. The P-40, too heavy. The Zero danced circles around them. But then something new begins to appear on the horizon. A strange plane, unlike anything you've seen before. It doesn't look sleek or elegant like your Zero. In fact, it looks bulky, almost awkward, with not one engine, but two, and a cockpit stuck in the middle of a twin-tail boom. You and your comrades laugh at first. Surely, this beast can't compete with the graceful Zero, but laughter soon turns into fear, because this machine isn't just another American plane. This is the P-38 Lightning, and for Japanese pilots, it would become the most dreaded opponent in the sky. More feared than the Mustang, more feared than the Corsair, the plane they called Nimagata, the two-tailed devil. Why did Japanese pilots fear it so much? Let's dive into the story. When the Pacific War began, Japan's Zero was unmatched. It had speed, agility, and range. Against early American planes, the Zero could turn tighter, climb faster, and dominate in dogfights. Japanese pilots were trained to lure their enemies into turning battles, and most Americans who took the bait never came home. But the Zero had weaknesses. It was lightly built. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks, little armor, and couldn't take much damage. The Japanese gambled everything on agility, and it worked for a while. But soon the Americans introduced the Lightning, and the game changed. The first thing that shocked Japanese pilots was altitude and speed. The P-38 could climb higher than the Zero, and it could dive faster. In fact, in a dive, the Zero simply couldn't keep up. If a P-38 decided to break away, there was no chance of catching it. That meant the old tactics didn't work anymore. Then came the firepower. While the Zero carried 2.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, they were mounted on the wings. That meant they had to be harmonized, adjusted to meet at a certain distance. If you fired too close or too far, your rounds spread apart. The Lightning didn't have that problem. All its weapons, 4 heavy .5 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon, were packed into the nose. No spread, no guessing. If you got an enemy in your sights, you just pulled the trigger and unleashed a storm of lead. Japanese pilots described the horror of seeing their comrades shredded in seconds by the Lightning's firepower. A Zero might survive a short burst from an American Wildcat or P-40, but against the Lightning, survival was rare. One pilot called it like flying into a wall of fire. And then there was the range. The Pacific is vast. Battles weren't fought a few miles from home. They were hundreds of miles away across endless stretches of ocean. Single-engine planes like the Mustang couldn't fly those missions early on, but the P-38, with its twin engines and long range, could. That meant the Lightning was often the first American fighter Japanese pilots faced when they least expected it, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, far beyond what should have been safe skies. The psychological effect was massive. Imagine flying, believing you're safe, and then seeing the strange silhouette of those twin tails in the distance. Japanese pilots knew instantly the fight was about to get ugly. But perhaps the moment that sealed the reputation forever came in 1943. American intelligence intercepted a Japanese message. Admiral Irisoku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. The Americans planned something daring. 16 P-38 Lightnings were chosen to intercept his flight. To pull this off, they had to fly over 400 miles at wave-top height, hugging the ocean to avoid detection. No other American fighter could have managed that distance at the time. Only the Lightning had the range, and they succeeded. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's plane was spotted and shot down by the P-38s. Japan lost its most important admiral. The news shocked the Japanese military, and it terrified Japanese pilots. The message was clear. This strange twin-tailed plane wasn't just powerful. It could reach anywhere. From then on, the Lightning wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of American reach and power. Japanese pilots started referring to it with fear. They nicknamed it the fork-tailed devil. It was the one plane you didn't want to see above you, because if it was there, escape was unlikely. American pilots, on the other hand, loved it. Richard Bong, America's top ace of World War II, scored 40 kills, most of them in a Lightning. Thomas Maguire, another ace, also flew it with deadly success. To them, the Lightning was fast, powerful, and reliable. To Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. Now here's the interesting part. Why not the Mustang? Why wasn't that the most feared plane? The answer lies in timing. The P-51 Mustang was legendary in Europe. It escorted bombers all the way into Germany, and it was one of the best fighters of the entire war. But in the Pacific, by the time the Mustang arrived in large numbers, Japan's Air Force was already weakened. Its best pilots were gone, and its factories couldn't keep up. The Lightning fought Japan when they were still strong, when the Zero was still a dangerous opponent, and it beat them. That's why in Japanese eyes, it was the true terror. By 1944, the skies had changed. The Zero was outdated. The American war machine was in full swing, and the Japanese could no longer keep up. But the one aircraft Japanese pilots remembered most, the one they talked about with a mix of respect and fear, was the Lightning. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was elegant, but because it changed the rules of the fight. It could climb where you couldn't. It could dive where you couldn't follow. It could shoot straighter, farther, and deadlier. And if it appeared in the distance, you knew your chances of going home had just dropped dramatically. That's why the P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil, became the plane Japanese pilots feared more than any other. And here's the kicker. History tends to celebrate the Mustang. It's the star of movies, documentaries, and air shows. But in the Pacific, the real star, or rather, the real nightmare, was the Lightning. So the next time someone tells you about the Mustang being the most feared American plane, remember the Pacific War. Because for the men who faced it, the name that made their blood run cold wasn't Mustang, it was Lightning. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. More incredible stories from World War II are coming your way. Stories that will surprise you, shock you, and keep you hooked until the very end. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.